and welcome to this time. These continue to be challenging times. A friend of mine said to me this week, I have sighed more this week than I have in a very long time. I feel that too. Heavy sighs for the ruling about the police who shot Breonna Taylor, and a feeling that there was not justice there. Prayers for Louisville and for next steps. Heavy sighs as we continue to grieve those who have been affected by the coronavirus, and over 200,000 people have died. We feel that grief and pray for comfort for family and friends, and pray for a vaccine and for a way forward that we as a country and a world can face this pandemic. Heavy sighs as we consider and understand more about threats to our democracy and the importance of voting in November. We need to work together because we value our democracy. Heavy sighs and giving thanks as we, as a country, celebrated the life and work of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, her amazing legacy, and prayers for her family and friends, and the work that still needs to be done. There have been many moments of beauty where we offer gratitude. It was good news, I noticed, that Yosemite is open again after days of being closed because of the smoke from the fires. Moments of beauty when friends call, when we feel encouraged by the beauty of creation. I want to open our time together today with a prayer. Holy and gracious God of risky love, of divine courage, to be ready to listen, we should know what it's like to be heard. To be good at giving support, we should know what it's like to be held. We give thanks that our best relationships not only provide additional strength, they help us practice the skills of being human and being vulnerable. Open us today to your Spirit. Help us to be people who are open to your love and grace. Amen.
Friends, hear this poem from 50 New Prayers from the Iona Community by Reinhild Traitler. You, greater than all we can think of, smaller than all we can imagine. You, farther than the universe and beyond, nearer than the secret of our hearts. You, breath of being, before us and behind us. You, force of life, above us and beneath us. You, speaking in many human tongues, whispering in the depths of our soul. You, inviting us into beloved community, encircling all people with love. We come into your presence to praise you because you are, and we are, through you and together with you, now and forever. Amen.
reading this morning comes from the book of Acts, chapter 2, verse 42, about that early community of faith, followers of Jesus. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. I want to read this verse from one other translation, the Message. They committed themselves to the teaching of the apostles, the life together, the common meal, and prayers. Let us pause for a moment of prayer. Holy and gracious one, we have heard words describing an early Christian community, early followers of the way, the ways of Jesus. May we hear these ancient words. May we be open to their truth. May we be transformed. Amen. Who is your family? Who is your community? Who is your tribe? I've been thinking about these questions this week. Maybe those are questions that have obvious answers at different times in our lives, but I think they can change over the course of our lives. Sometimes we are part of a group because of where we were born or our birth family. And other groups we choose or reject or are rejected by. In the last 6 months, many aspects of our lives related to these questions have to do with belonging, and a lot has changed. Because of the risks of the spread of the coronavirus, we couldn't be physically present with many of the people in our circles in our lives, with family members, friends, our church, people at work, even in our neighborhood. So when we think about what groups do we belong to, what are we part of, these last 6 months have felt different because we couldn't be with them in a ways we wanted to be. So we can reflect on these questions. What do they mean now? Have our answers changed? And what can we learn from the redwood trees and biblical images and current challenges that we're facing? If you've been part of our church or tuning into these online services and sermons, you'll know that throughout the month of September, we have been focusing on the theme of spiritual redwoods. We have been exploring what can we learn from redwood trees and sequoias. One of the reasons we've done that is we have 5 amazing, beautiful, very tall coast redwoods on the property of our church, First Presbyterian Church in San Rafael. And on Sunday mornings, we have gathered on our patio in front of our redwood trees. So this is the 4th week as we've explored this theme together. The first week was on the seeds of redwoods locked into those small pine cones. The seeds are so small and yet produce something that is large and of great beauty. That is true in life. Sometimes some of the smallest things offer beauty and hope in ways we would not have expected. The next week we looked at the roots of redwood trees and how they are shallow and yet spread out and interlock, and how it means for us to be intertwined and connected and nourish each other as the Spirit nourishes us. Last week we looked at the bark and the trunk of redwood trees and what refuge and strength and protection means in the life of a redwood tree and groves, and what we sense about God's refuge and strength in the midst of facing individual and global challenges. We're going to finish today and think about how redwood trees grow and where they grow. These beautiful 5 coast redwoods that are outside my office window in an area outside the church next to the patio are in a circle, in a ring. And that's significant. I remember when I first visited Muir Woods years ago, down south of where we are, between here and the Golden Gate Bridge. And I remember noticing that most of the redwoods seemed to be growing in circles. Here's what I learned, and I remember reading one of the signs in that park. It was placed next to one of the circles, and it said, hundreds of years ago, a single large redwood grew here, and then disaster struck. The trunk of a large redwood was killed, perhaps by repeated and severe wildfire. From where you're standing in Muir Woods, it said you can see the original tree trunk is still standing upright, now dead and a blackened snag. But despite such terrible damage, the tree did not die. Below the ground, its massive root system was full of vitality. And before long, hundreds of young, bright green burl sprouts began to come up around the circle formed by the root crown of the original tree. And some of those sprouts have grown into full-sized trees that today stand in a circle around the original trunk. That's what redwood trees do. They grow in circles. On another site, I was reading another description. A fairy ring is a common name for a group of redwood trees growing in a circle, usually around the stump of an old-growth tree that either fell or was cut down. And a new generation of trees sprout from the roots from that fallen redwood, and they really do create an almost perfect circle or ring. It's interesting because this is one of the ways redwoods regenerate, giving them tremendous advantages having had a full root system. Advantages over trees and plants that only grow from seeds. Although for many years it was thought that all the trees in the ring were identical, there is some new research. I read about this. Redwoods growing close together in a fairy ring, or even directly connected at their trunk bases, are not actually clones. About 10% of the time, something has changed in the trees in that ring. These individuals were a result of sexual reproduction. They were sprouts from a neighboring tree or a mutation that led to these to be different than the others in the ring. So that's interesting. Redwoods remind us that they belong together and share a root system, but they are not identical. They have some individuality. They're intertwined. They share resources for growth and health. They help protect each other from storms and threats. And isn't it interesting that generations support each other? I think these are some of the best qualities of community that we can learn from them, and they belong together. Luke, who wrote in the New Testament both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, Luke writes about a vision for the newly forming communities that follow Jesus, and that's the passage I read this morning. It really was a bold thing to do because it didn't really square this vision of what people might have been experiencing under Roman oppression and very difficult times. He wrote this glowing vision as an encouragement. As one writer put it, this reading describes a state of affairs that looks very attractive but seems so unrealistic. that's really beyond our reach. It's a hopeful vision of justice and service, of people sharing things in common. That's part of the description in Acts as well. Something about the Spirit moving in the life of those people who came together was changing them. It was a different kind of community. The idea of community, I think, both simultaneously attracts us, this vision in Luke, and maybe repels us and challenges us. We long for life-affirming benefits that community can bestow, but we might resist the demands that being in community makes. People have debated about the book of Acts and this particular part of chapter 2, whether it is really something that Christians and Christian communities can aspire to. Was it real? Was Luke describing something that was happening, or was it a bigger vision to aspire to? Maybe it represents the best of what we might imagine, what we are capable of, what we lean into, even though we will never achieve perfection. The life and work of a community of faith, a church, can reflect, if even dimly, aspects of this vision of being together in a community of faith, praying, worshiping, eating, and sharing in life in common. Those early churches were primarily house churches. Sometimes they went to the temple. Prayer, worship, learning, eating, sharing with one another, and all were welcome. Women and men, rich and poor, Jews and Greeks. It was a new kind of tribe. It was no longer based on your ethnic identity or your class. It was radical, what was happening in Jerusalem that began to spread. And this sense of belonging, it is a central part of being part of a church. That is our hope for this church. These questions come up as we think about those redwood trees and this vision in Acts. Who is your family? Who is your community? Who is your tribe? These are questions of belonging. Who is in your tree circle? I think belonging is a blessing, a feeling. As one writer put it, we humans are a social species. We look for tribes to belong to. We are given to gathering and communing in familiar groups. Belonging, our capacity and need for empathy, compassion, communication, it's in our DNA as human beings. There are so many positive sides of belonging, and that's important, but there is that tribal side of being human related to our social relationships. We can be belligerent and brutal. Our species is creative and loving, but it can be destructive and hostile. Tribal animosities, that feeling of my tribe is better than yours, has always been part of our history as human beings, whether it's between countries or enemies. There are close-knit tribes within countries that identify with each other, and hate can grow, often based on prejudice around religion, ethnicity, race, economics, or politics. Tribal conflicts divide and can grow violent. As inspiring as humanity is, this possibility of tribalism can grow into anger and hate. It can dominate people's thoughts. We want a sense of belonging, and it can be life-giving. But tribalism can destroy that. And we seem to be living in a time in our country when the question of who do you belong to, who is your tribe, and how do you treat those who you perceive are outside of that, are creating incredible divisiveness and threats, I think, to our democracy. We need a sense of belonging, but we don't need to perceive that those who are in different tribes are somehow a threat and that we need to fear. I've been thinking a lot about this paradox. We want and need to be part of circles of belonging, and we might say, I found my tribe. I found people who care about the things I do and are committed to that in a church, in a community, all kinds of groups. But that it doesn't turn into we are better than. We need to get rid of. We need to prevent other tribes from existing, from having power. We live within that. When I first came to this church, the men's group was reading an interesting book. I haven't read the book, but I was remembering some of the conversations I had. The book is called Political Tribes by Amy Chua. She explores these complex questions, and there was a lot of interest in her book when it came out, Political Tribes, because it comes from the strong sense that Chua both condemns tribalism and respects its power. It's real. She insists that the United States alone of nations among the earth can transcend a lot of tribalism. She reckons with the many tribalisms of the American past, ethnic, religious, and racial, and she hopes for a future in which tribalism fades, but she acknowledges with great detail its accumulating strength. How do we live in a country where we continue to see this grow? I think it's a challenge we need to keep talking about and exploring, listening, and working toward ways that our tribes are not fixed, that there's an openness to our circles of belonging. Keep thinking about those questions for yourself, for our church and community. Who is your family? Who is your community? Who is your tribe? And how might it include those beyond the traditional circles? Can the church, our church, offer hope and a vision that invites belonging, that is life-giving, and moves us outside of our tribe? Not rigid tribal lines, even for Christianity, for the Christian household, for white people. How do we keep looking at who has been our tribe and what does that mean, and how might that grow and change? How might we look for ways to celebrate community? One of my favorite movies that explored this on a maybe simple but beautiful level was called Because of Winn-Dixie. It's a story about a little girl who creates her own tribe. It's a story of how a stray dog helps change life for the better for this little girl named Opal. One writer said, we might say about this movie that it is the story of how God uses a dog as a channel of grace and creating a new tribe. In the movie, Opal goes on an errand to the local Winn-Dixie grocery store, and a stray dog walks in, and she ends up taking the dog home and naming it Winn-Dixie. Her dad is a preacher and starting a new church, a little congregation that meets in a converted convenience store. And Opal and her dad are kind of alone there in this new place, and Opal's mother has left, and so she feels alone in the world, but Opal starts to connect with people in the community. She finds a mother figure in some older women, a white woman named Franny Block, who's the librarian, and an African-American woman named Gloria Dump, who is a recluse and loves growing things. She makes other friends that are kind of on the outside. There are some kids who kind of bully Opal, and she struggles with that. But the film culminates in this party that Opal and Gloria Dump throw in Gloria Dump's backyard. And Opal makes colorful invitations for all these people in town to come to this party. And she gives it to the people who have not been very loving or nice to her, as well as her friends. And they come. And it's this moment of what we might say the reign of God, a kingdom, a hopeful vision of community could look like, that this little girl created a new kind of tribe. I wonder, who is your family? Who is your community? Who is your tribe? How might we continue to grow into that? I'm so grateful for this church and the ways that you are living into, even in the midst of this pandemic, and maybe more so, to care for one another, to encourage one another, and you are looking out into the community. Who is vulnerable? Who needs food? Who needs help with rent? How are we together saying we are one tribe? We will help each other. I hope that as we move into the future, that we see these circles of belonging that are not closed and that there are room for more. That we are attentive to relationships and what means to sustain them. I pray that we can resist tribalism and have a larger vision. I pray that we are open to the Spirit that weaves us together, and that we remember we are rooted and grounded in love. Amen.
Let us build a house where love can dwell and all can safely live. A place where saints and children tell how hearts learn to forgive. Built of hopes and dreams and visions, rock of faith and vault of grace. Here the love of Christ shall end divisions. All are welcome, all are welcome, all are welcome in this place. Let us build